potentially one of the most drawn-out sagas in all of NBA history, finally came to a close just a few nights ago as the night before the 2026 NBA Draft, the Milwaukee Bucks shipped out all-time great, former MVP, former Finals MVP, and all-time great Giannis Antetokounmpo to the Miami Heat for an absolute haul of draft picks and young pieces. And the question now is, does this make the Miami Heat a real title contender? Or are they still lagging behind the rest of the top teams in the East? Let's break it down. This is the RL Report with Ryan Luke. Obviously, that question at the start is a bit of a loaded one. You know, it's not necessarily a yes or no answer that we can answer right this second, but I think it is important to look at the grand scheme of things and look at how this trade affects each of the teams involved. And so for those unfamiliar, here is what the trade was. According to Shams Charania from ESPN, the Milwaukee Bucks are trading franchise icon Giannis Antetokounmpo and Bobby Portis to the Miami Heat for Tyler Hero, Kel'el Ware, Jaime Jaquez Jr., Kasparis Jakučionis, 3 first-round picks, including what was the number 13 pick in the NBA draft just a few nights ago, where the Bucks ended up selecting Nate Ament, 1 pick swap, and 1 second-rounder, sources tell ESPN. Now, that is a ton to give up for one player, but rightfully so. You're giving it up for a guy who, when healthy, is basically a top 3 to 5 player in the entirety of the NBA, a former MVP, a former Finals MVP, a former Defensive Player of the Year. This guy can do it all outside of, knock down 40% of his threes. But you don't need him to do that with how dominant he is. And when we take a look at this package, I want to take a look at how it affects the Miami Heat first. Now, obviously, they're giving up a ton of first-round picks. That number 13 pick in the 2026 NBA draft that ended up becoming Nate Ament, that's a valuable pick. That's a lottery pick right there. And you're giving up 2 more first-rounders on top of that, a first-round pick swap, and then a second-rounder. Plenty of draft capital that, could potentially come back to bite you down the road if this experiment fails. And I think that's something to keep an eye on and to kind of keep in the back of your mind, because after this trade, the Miami Heat really do not have a whole lot of resources and picks to dip into when you look at what they have over the next 6 or 7 years. This includes, a max of 4 first-round picks, but that all depends if one of the first that they owe to Charlotte conveys or not. And then obviously with the new CBA, certain picks are locked, meaning that the Heat physically cannot trade them. So in essence, they really don't have any tradable first-round picks left. And they only have, I believe, 1 or 2 second-round picks in general in their control over these next 6 years. So they are effectively all in when you talk about this Miami Heat roster. And it is important to note, yes, they got an all-time great. And I want to put that out there and say, anytime you can go and get someone of Giannis's caliber, you kind of have to go out there and do it. But, and this but is a major thing for me. If we're talking about grading this deal, we're talking about how I see this deal put together, I would give the Miami Heat a C-. And the reason behind that is, in simplest terms, I don't think this roster is good enough to win anything. I think unless there is massive injuries across the top teams in the Eastern Conference, they are a second-round exit at best. Yes, a second-round exit at best, even after trading for a top 3 to 5 player in the league in Giannis Antetokounmpo. And there's a lot to do with that. And for one, you take a look about what they gave up. I already talked about the draft picks that they gave up. Well, let's talk about the players. They gave up Tyler Hero. That's a guy who's made an All-Star game in the past. Yes, when you look at the advanced metrics, you look at on-offs, you look at net rating, he doesn't really impact the game really positively or negatively in a major way. But he is someone who has been steady for you, over his time in Miami. And as I said, he made an All-Star game, so that's a valuable player. He's a good player. He's not a great player, in my opinion. And so you lose him. That's key shooting, though, that you would want when you're going to have a front court right now of Bam Adebayo and Giannis Antetokounmpo. Additionally, you give up Kel'el Ware, a guy who we've seen just look absolutely dominant in certain games in his young career so far. Obviously, there's some concern about the motor and the attitude. We know that there were some run-ins with him and Coach Spo, and, you know, I can't read too much into that because obviously Heat culture is a thing, and they do things their own way there. There's a reason that they're one of the best player development teams in the entirety of the league. They push their guys so hard, and they ask so much of them, and certain guys just aren't cut out for it. Maybe Khalil Ware isn't cut out for it, but what I do tell you is that he is a modern-day prototypical big. A big that can shoot the three, is very mobile at his 6'11 size, super long wingspan, good rebounder, good rim protector, can really fit in anywhere. And so despite all of this talent, we saw at times Coach Spo not trust him in the biggest moments and not really want to play him. And so I understand, maybe that's not as big of a loss for the Heat in particular, but when I'm evaluating it of him as a player and what he can be moving forward, I think that's a pretty big piece to lose. And then also, you give up Jaime Jaquez Jr., one of the most reliable and consistent bench players in the entirety of the NBA, a guy that kind of can do anything that's asked of him. High character, high effort, going to try his best on defense, can facilitate a little bit as a wing, good at getting downhill and shooting mid-range. Not a great three-point shooter, but he gives you basically everything else, and he wasn't on an expensive contract. As I said, he can play kind of in any system, and in their system last year where it was very, isolation heavy to create mismatches after in constant movement, high pace, high shot totals, he fit perfectly into that. Additionally, you give up Kasparis Jakučionis, a very, very high ceiling guard who had a heck of a freshman year at Illinois with some really high highs and some really low lows. His rookie year didn't play a ton. There wasn't really a need / a ton of minutes in a big role for him anyways, but he's a guy that I really liked coming out of the draft at Illinois. And as I said, 6'5", can shoot, handle the ball, good facilitator. He's someone that, again, I think that's a high-value piece building for the future, but I understand if you're the Miami Heat and you're going to be, pushing for competing right now, you're going to trade away those guys. But those three, in addition to Tyler Hero, is so much player capital, and it's so much younger player capital. I mean, even a guy like Tyler Hero, we've been talking about him for so long, it feels like, and he's still only 26. So he's still a good 6 years younger than Giannis is. And that's how puts it into perspective. Giannis is 32, so this window isn't going to be open forever, and he's a guy that relies on athleticism. And that's something else that I want to bring up when I'm talking about this Heat side and why I don't particularly love the move. And as I said, why I don't see them being in the upper echelon of Eastern Conference teams at this point in time. Take a look at Giannis. He has struggled with a lot of injuries, particularly calf injuries, as of late the last few seasons. Missed a ton of games. Obviously, some of the games he did miss were because of quarrels with the Bucks. The Bucks didn't want him to further injure himself and injure his trade value in the case that they did trade him like they did here. And so I can't fault him for that. But when he's a guy who relies almost entirely on athleticism, brute force, his length, he doesn't really shoot threes. He's a good mid-range shooter, not a great mid-range shooter. I don't love betting on a 32-year-old with, growing injury history who relies on athleticism to age well moving forward. Especially what's good for the Heat is that he is only under contract for 2 more years. And it sounds like Miami is one of the teams that he was willing to sign an extension with, which is why the Miami Heat were so willing to put together this massive package. But either way, again, as I said, the injuries have been piling up. You rely on athleticism. Those guys historically show us that they don't age as well. They don't last as long. Their level of play can be, severely hampered as they continue to grow older and as, their body just can't handle the peak athleticism and what they ask it to do. Not everyone can be LeBron. Not everyone can just look Father Time in the face and be like, nah, I'm good. And while I'm saying it's not impossible that Giannis does that, and again, he's only 32. He's not 37 or 40. But we haven't really seen a player like Giannis physically and his style of play before. We've seen similar ones. And as I said, the history tells us, okay, maybe the production drops off. Maybe he continues to struggle with injuries and we never get to see him fully healthy, locked in with this Heat roster, and that is something that I'm worried about moving forward. Additionally, beyond all of that, when we take a look at this Heat roster, it's decimated. Yes, you have Giannis. Yes, you have Bam Adebayo. That is arguably one of the best defensive front courts that we've ever seen in the history of the NBA. That is two of the elite defenders when healthy and when locked in on that end. Not to mention, you also have Andrew Wiggins, who is a fantastic defender in his own right because of his athleticism. And he's a guy who played a major role on the Golden State Warriors winning a championship in 2022. The interesting part is that he has a player option. We haven't heard any decision as of this recording of whether he's picked it up or not, or, if he's going to try to help this Miami Heat depleted depth squad right now by opting out of his player option and just re-signing on a more team-friendly extension. That'll be something I'm going to keep my eye on. But as of right now, I see a starting lineup of Davion Mitchell, probably Pelle Larsson, Andrew Wiggins, Bam Adebayo, and Giannis Antetokounmpo. Not a ton of spacing. Not my favorite offensive team. I think that this would be a very, very good defense. And, obviously having Eric Spoelstra as your coach is going to work wonders. You're going to be able to make up for some of the deficiencies on each of your individual players just because he is so crafty with his schemes and also just the player development. You could see major jumps in certain areas of each of these players. But out of those five, as it is, I don't think that's a better starting lineup than the New York Knicks. I don't think that's a better starting lineup than Boston. I don't think that's a better starting lineup than the Pistons, especially when it's clear that the Pistons are going to be aggressive to adding to the roster. And you take a look at the Heat, they are in a position right now, and everything points to it. All the reporters, Brian Windhorst, Shams Charania, are saying they do not have the space, and they are preparing to lose Norman Powell. So yes, you get Giannis Antetokounmpo, but you lose all those depth pieces, Khalil Ware, Jaime Jaquez Jr., Kasparis Jakučionis, and you lose Tyler Hero and Norman Powell out of your starting lineup in addition to that. That hurts a lot. And, maybe you could say, okay, getting back Bobby Portis kind of helps, deal with that sting a little bit, and I will agree to a certain level, but I don't think that he's necessarily a huge needle mover in the general scope of things, even though he is coming off of a career season shooting the ball from three, which is just what the Miami Heat need when you take a look at this lineup. But as we continue, you take a look at the depth. Bobby Portis, great bench piece. I mean, you could start him. I would probably use him as one of your primary scorers off the bench as your sixth man. But then right now you have Drew Smith, Myron Gardner, Jameer Young, and Nikola Jovic as the rest of your bench. Terrible. Not a team that you can compete with. The worst bench than the Pacers, the Cavs, the Knicks, the Celtics, the Pistons, maybe the Hawks. The Hornets, they just made a blockbuster move today. They have a ton of good pieces. They lost, arguably, someone who can tip the scales in their favor because he's such a good player in LaMelo Ball. But I don't know how this team separates itself or really makes noise in this Eastern Conference. And as I'm saying, if I had to sit here right now, again, I don't know what the rest of the roster is going to fill out with. It's plausible that, some, pretty decent vets that are on the buyout market or are free agents and are willing to sign for vet minimums may take a little bit of a pay cut to come fill out that roster and have a chance to win a championship, kind of like we saw guys like Jordan Clarkson do this past year for the New York Knicks. But even if that's the case, I just don't see how this roster has enough firepower on the offensive end to win a championship or really go super, super far in the playoffs. And again, you're betting on the health of Giannis. You're betting on the health of a guy like Bam Adebayo, who is coming off of, his highest offensive load of the season. Unfortunately got injured in the play-in game, which that wasn't his fault. But, if Bam or Giannis goes down, you have absolutely zero chance. You're a bottom 10 team in the league if that happens, arguably bottom 5. So you have to hope that you're fully healthy. You have to hope that there's injuries to the rest of the Eastern Conference. And even then, absolute best, I saw somewhere that they were pushing for 5th on title odds. This team is not even the 5th best team in the Eastern Conference. As I said, and I'll keep repeating this, that's why I'm saying I'm giving them a C- because, and it arguably should be lower. As I said, you're paying a ton in premium young assets. You're paying a ton in draft pick capital. You're betting on a guy who's coming off of multiple injuries and whose game tells all the signs tell us he's not going to perform well as he continues to age and that his level of play is going to drop, and you don't have any depth. The only thing saving it is that it is Giannis Antetokounmpo that we're talking about. And I will say it one last time before I move over to the Bucks side and why I really love this trade for them. And that is, you are not going to be better than the New York Knicks, guaranteed. Barring injury, of course. I'm not wishing injury on anyone, not wishing injury on the Heat, not wishing an injury on anyone in the East. You're not going to be better than the Knicks. You're not going to be better than Boston. You're not going to be better than Detroit, especially with the move that they make. I don't think you're going to be better than a healthy Pacers coming back with Tyrese Halliburton. I don't think you're going to be better than the Cavaliers. That's 5 teams right there. Knicks, Pacers, Celtics, Pistons, Cavs. You could throw the Hornets could be better. Who knows what the Wizards look like if Anthony Davis and Trae Young are healthy. Like, to me, this team screams bottom end of the East. I wouldn't be shocked if they end up in the play-in spot as a 7 or 8 seed. That's what we're talking about. The East, it may not be as top-heavy of a conference of the OKC Thunder, the San Antonio Spurs, who knows what the new look Minnesota Timberwolves or, rejuvenated Denver Nuggets looks like. May not have that absolute top of the top when you take a look at, those are probably your favorites, OKC and the Spurs. And then you go to the East, it's the Knicks and the Celtics and all that. But the East is so talented and they're all on similar tiers. The issue is I don't think that the Miami Heat can out-talent any of those teams, and I don't think they have as good of a roster construction as any of those teams that I've talked about. And so for that reason, that's why this team's ceiling after trading for Giannis, again, at this point in time, on June 25th at 9:20 p.m., is the second round, in my opinion. They will not sniff an Eastern Conference Finals with the team as currently constructed. Can they pull some strings and maybe do a sign-in trade away Norman Powell, and a sign-in trade to the Detroit Pistons, who have been said to show interest for, a very big Heat culture guy, a guy who was there for their finals runs in Duncan Robinson, that would help a lot. I think that's a good bench piece. I still don't think that's this absolute big change that you need to win. I saw some people saying, well, what if Chris Middleton, wants to sign for the low and join his buddy Giannis Antetokounmpo? It's not the same Chris Middleton of the old, and another guy who's been dealing with a ton of injuries. So I don't necessarily know if that's always your best route, especially when you already lack depth, to bet on an older guy who's been dealing with injuries to stay healthy. And so, I feel like I've talked about it enough, but as I reiterated, I'm giving this trade for the Miami Heat a C-, and I just absolutely don't like it outside of the fact that you're getting Giannis Antetokounmpo, and that's the only thing saving it for me. Now, we flip over to the Bucks side. I know that was long-winded. I apologize, but I really am passionate about this, and I don't see a world where the Heat are much better than the Bucks of the last few years when Giannis was healthy. But anyways, on the Bucks side, I absolutely love this trade. As I said, I'm a big fan of Khalil Ware. I think that he has a super high ceiling, and, maybe with getting the ball more and being more of a focal point, we can see what happens in Milwaukee. Maybe a change of scenery is good for him. Jaime Jaquez Jr., you know what you're going to get. And it's consistent, reliable production who's going to impact winning in positive ways. Kasper Chakachonis, huge upside. This Milwaukee Bucks team also, by the way, had one of the most improved player finalists and one of the, rising young stars, I want to say, in the league. And a lot of you might not know it if you didn't really pay super attention to the Bucks, and that's Ryan Rollins. He had an absolutely amazing season, getting a ton of uptick in his usage percentage, and he just looked like a completely different player than we've ever seen. He is absolutely a building block going for the Bucks moving forward. And though he's not improved in this trade, when you have him and then you add all these younger guys to the puzzle, it just excites me so much about this Bucks team, which for a long time, their future post Giannis and even with Giannis the last 2 years has looked so bleak. It's looked like, they're just holding on to any little last glimmer of hope they have that they can compete for something. And then also I talked about the young pieces. Tyler Hero, he's a kid who's from that area. Maybe a homecoming refreshes him, rejuvenates him. He's a guy who's dealt with injury. Maybe he feels, more at home, more comfortable, and we see him, start to ascend back to a level he was just a few years ago. And even if you don't, guess what? He's a guy who will be a hot commodity on the market. Yes, as I said, he hasn't been shown by the advanced metrics on the Heat as of late to impact winning a massive way, one way or the other, positive or negatively. But you can't discount his shooting. You can't discount his secondary ball handling. You can't discount shot creation. That's the name of the game in the modern NBA. And so this trade tree could just continue to expand, and the Bucks can add more assets, more young, fun pieces. And that is just exciting to me. It really interests me. Furthermore, this Bucks team, as I talked about it, they were so depleted in their future. This was a team that virtually had control of none of their picks outside of the ones they physically could not access, that were locked away because of the stipend rule, because they are not allowed to access those picks yet, because the modern CBA does not want teams to absolutely bottom out like you saw the Brooklyn Nets do in the mid to early 2010s. And now you take a look at this team. They don't have an absolute surplus of draft picks, but they're back to being a passable team. They have control of 7 first-round picks over the next 7 years. That's good. They're no longer at a deficit. In fact, they're right on schedule, and they have additional second-round picks, which is nice. They also have a pick swap, which who knows? Again, if there's injuries with the Heat and, they're in the play-in, or, they're just outside the playoffs. Remember, in the new lottery system, those teams have really good odds at getting a high pick. And so you could see the Milwaukee Bucks, by trading Giannis, end up with a top pick if something goes haywire in this whole situation. And so that's something else I want to keep an eye on. And then additionally, one of the first rounders that was included was the pick of Nate Ament. Now, I admittedly am not super high on Nate Ament right now. I had him ranked 26th or 25th on my big board, and I had him in my own tier, his own tier on my big board, and that was the boom or bust tier. And I think that's the best way to put it. The dude shot 40% from the field, 30% from 3, and a just terrible percentage at the rim. But he's a super good job of getting to the rim and drawing fouls, which is a good indicator and a good baseline skill to have entering the league, because, your shooting percentages can creep up, but if you're just not crafty and you're not, willing to go in there and take contact, you can't automatically just change your game completely like that when you get to the league. It's a tougher psychological thing. You can fix your jump shot, you can work on those types of things and increase your fluidity, increase your percentages with just more practice, but it's that mentality, that comfortability with getting downhill, that craftiness. And so that's something fun. And why not take a swing like this if you're the Milwaukee Bucks? You took a swing when you drafted Giannis at number 15 years and years ago, and he ended up being arguably the greatest player in your franchise's history and a top 20 to 25 player ever. Why not take another swing? And I'm not saying that Nate Ament is going to be anything close to Giannis. I think even if Nate Ament hits his ceiling of ceiling, he's not Giannis. No one is. He's one of one. But this is a guy that at 6'10" can do absolutely everything if the pick hits and if he reaches his ceiling. And you can't teach that. He'd be a guy who has no holes in his game, can shoot the three, can handle the ball at 6'10", decent passer, can get downhill, as I said, and get to the rack. And hopefully, his finishing would be improved. Gets to the free throw line, good defender, athletic, smart, willing to work hard, all that stuff. It's the total package. It's what I think of when I see, a guy like Jason Tatum, where he's one of my favorite players in the league, because you look at him and you go, he has no holes arguably in his game from a skill standpoint. Maybe he doesn't always take the best shots, but there's nothing he can't do. And I feel like if Nate Ament hits his ceiling, there's nothing that Nate Ament can't do. And so I think that it's an absolute perfect situation for the Bucks to take a swing on a guy like Nate Ament, and it also provides him with a good situation because he's not going to be forced into having to win games right away and forced into a very small role where he can't develop, he can't get the reps because they're attempting to make a playoff push if Giannis was still there. And then additionally, I know that this pick wasn't included in the trade, but you talk about the Bucks went out and got Braden Burries at number 10 with their own selection from this past year. So you take the absolute boom or bust guy, where if everything goes well, that's a star. That's a franchise cornerstone, absolutely. And you take a guy like Braden Burries, who's a do-it-all guy, elite defender, one of the best transition players in all of college basketball last year. Severely increased his three-point percentage, was shooting over 40% from three from December on throughout this season in college basketball. And also, he was tested. At Arizona, he played with guys like Koa Pete, with Jaden Bradley, with Toby Awaka. There were nights where he was going to be the guy, and then there's nights where he was going to be your second, third, fourth option, and he did whatever was asked of him. He played that role perfectly, was very coachable, good leader, hard worker, and his skill set. He's one of these guys, as I said, great defender, can handle the ball, great and crafty getting downhill, knows how to use his physicality and his athleticism, and his jump shot showed significant improvement and was actually pretty elite towards the end of the season. This is a guy that is perfect. He's a glue guy. You slide him in anywhere in any sort of rotation, and he fits in perfectly. You take that, which is the perfect contrast to taking the boomer bust guy in Nate Ament. And so for me, that is absolutely perfect. I love that pairing, and I know that Braden Burries was not a part of the trade, but that's just something else that excites me about the future and is partly, adding to the grade for the Bucks, is just that I love that they're going all in. And yes, you could have traded for Jaylen Brown if you're from the Bucks perspective and gotten, maybe a couple first round picks in addition. But those first round picks are not going to be worth anything if they're from Boston. I think the first round picks from Miami are worth way more, and Boston wasn't willing to give you Hugo Gonzalez or Baylor Shireman or any of its other younger pieces. They were just going to give you Jaylen Brown, and you could ship off Jaylen Brown for younger pieces. But do you want to have to worry, and teams will then possibly know, okay, they don't want him. Jaylen Brown doesn't want to be in Milwaukee. He may want to be rerouted, and that hurts the trade value. Whereas if you're Milwaukee, you get these great young players, as pieces in this deal from Miami, and it allows you to kind of evaluate and build from scratch. And in the modern CBA, it's very important to be able to have, a bunch of young players that you can develop and kind of grow in your system, because the modern day CBA values homegrown talent. And so in all of that being said, I don't know if I said it earlier, but I am absolutely giving the Bucks an A on this trade. The only reason it's not an A+ is obviously, return could always be more. And some people may argue, well, what about the Luka Doncic trade last year? That's an easy A+. Well, that was just a mistake by Nico Harrison. And so I'm not going to use that on my scale when I'm comparing trades to each other. Me personally, I love this deal for the Milwaukee Bucks. I thought they got elite value both in players and picks. And I think that they have, real excitement for the future. And I don't know if you had that with a roster that was relying on Giannis, Bobby Portis, Kyle Kuzma, and Miles Turner moving forward. I just don't. That doesn't move me. I'm not excited. And yet now I am excited of a roster with Khalil Ware and Jaime Jaquez Jr. and Kasparis Jakuchonis and Ryan Rollins and Nate Ament and Braden Burries and whoever else they end up bringing in. Maybe you trade Tyler Hero in for additional picks or another younger player plus one pick. Who knows? But that excites me, and I think that I'm proud of the Bucks, and I love it because they are finally understanding where they are at. They know, hey, we need to hit that hard reset button, and it's okay to do that. And for them, it could not have been better, and that is why they are an A, and why I gave the Miami Heat a C-. I still do not understand this from the Miami Heat's perspective, other than, hey, we're going to up ticket sales, we're going to up revenue, up ad, share, because everyone's going to be interested in our team. But I don't think it's going to lead to a whole lot of winning and any banners of any sort. And so that's my breakdown of the Miami Heat and the Milwaukee Bucks trade for Giannis Antetokounmpo. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. I want to keep pumping out content to you guys as much as I can, covering the draft, covering, any trades that may go down, free agency, team previews, all of that. So if you want to keep watching my content and keep staying locked in on all of that, don't forget to hit the noti bell and hit like, comment, subscribe, stay up to date. I want to keep bringing you guys this content and sharing with you, just a little bit more insight into the NBA, increasing your ball knowledge. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.